Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Giovanna Gossage, and I'm the Chief Librarian at the United Nations Library in Vienna. Today, we are welcoming three lovely authors who have edited together the Evolution of Illicit Flows, Displacement and Convergence Among Transnational Crime, and will be sharing lessons learned with us from the writing and the editing of this book. So let me start by introducing each of our speakers. So Ernesto Savona is a professor of criminology and director of Transcrime, Joint Research Center on Innovation and Crime at the Universitat Cattolica of Sacred Heart in Milan. Since 2003, he has been the editor-in-chief of the European Journal on Criminal Policy and Research, an international refereed journal published by Springer. He has been a consultant to the UN, Council of Europe, the European Union, the Australian government. He was also nominated president of the European Society of Criminology for the years 2003 to 2004. In June 2011, he was appointed chair for the term 2011 to 2012 of the Global Agenda Council on Organized Crime of the World Economic Forum. He has coordinated international projects funded by local, national, and international entities and has published extensively on organized economic crime, corruption, illicit markets, money laundering, mafias, and prevention policies against organized crime. So thank you for joining us, Ernesto. Our next speaker is Alberto Aziani. He is also a professor of criminology at the Universitat Cattolica de Sacro Cuore and a researcher at Transcrime in Milan. His primary areas of research expertise are transnational crimes, organized crime, illicit markets, and illicit financial flows. He has contributed to these fields through publications in numerous peer-reviewed journals and by overseeing projects for international organizations and funding institutions. And finally, we have Rob Guerette, who is a professor of criminology and criminal justice in the School of International and Public Affairs at Florida. So he is our early morning joiner. He holds a doctorate from Rutgers University, was a fellow at Eagleton Institute of Politics and Rutgers University, and served as a U.S. Fulbright specialist to Iceland. His research interests primarily focus on transnational crime, situational crime prevention, problem and community-oriented policing, and program and policy evaluation. He serves as a senior researcher for the crime prevention section of the Crime Solutions Resource Center, the scientific evidence-based clearinghouse of the U.S. Department of Justice. He is also affiliated with the Center for Problem-Oriented Policing and served as the advisor and coordinator for the annual International Herman Goldstein Awards for Excellence in Problem-Oriented Policing for 14 years. In addition, he's worked on projects in consultation, collaboration, or affiliation with the U.S. Department of Homeland Security, Border Patrol, and the U.S. State Department and the U.S. Department of Defense. So he has done a lot of collaborative work with many law enforcement institutions. Welcome to all three of you, and thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks, Giovanna, for the invitation.
No, we're really excited to have you. So colleagues, this session will be recorded. We will be posting it at a later point on YouTube. And at this point, I will give the floor over to our speakers. Please go ahead.
Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for having us, Giovanna. I'm going to get us started here. My name is Rob Guerette, and I was privileged to work on this project and play just a small part under the leadership of Professor Savona and the excellent stewardship and administration of Professor Aziani. Next slide. Inevitably, when you look across the world surrounding efforts to secure borders and deal with illicit markets that cross those borders, you have claims and concerns of displacement and convergence. And many of these claims are based on valid anecdotal evidence but there's no real empirical assessment on the transnational level that has documented it. And in some ways, these claims and criticisms fall into what might be considered a fallacy of absolutism. And that absolutism happens in two ways. One, that it will absolutely occur no matter what intervention is put into place. And two, that it will absolutely be equal to the original problem that was trying to be addressed. But because data on the transnational level is quite limited and analysis of these phenomena is quite limited, we're really left with an incomplete understanding of how this all happens and what extent and role displacement and convergence plays. And so that was really the context that kind of led this project, trying to illuminate through systematic empirical analysis informed by a more complete understanding of the features that drive potential for displacement and convergence. And this is a screenshot of the book here for all of you to go out and grab your copy and read it front to back. And we encourage you to do that. There's a lot of excellent chapters within. Go ahead. Yep. And when you look at displacement on the transnational level, it's quite limited in terms of analysis, but fortunately within the domestic local area, we've been actually studying from the crime science perspective displacement for over 30 years. And we had a body of literature and understanding to help inform the book chapter authors in their examinations. And so taking from that, we see that this absolutist view becomes undermined. And when we look at displacement on the local domestic level, we've recognized various forms and varieties of displacement geographically or place, the movement in time, changing targets, changing offenses, and changing tactics. And it's important, of course, to understand the extent of displacement or the likelihood of displacement when we're formulating interventions and anti-crime initiatives, because at its extreme, it can undermine your very intent, right? Oftentimes, people claim there's a sixth form of displacement, but that's debatable, and that is offender displacement, but others claim that is actually replacement and not a form of displacement. So next slide. So when we brought together at the beginning of the project our understanding of where we were on the research evaluation from environmental criminology and the crime sciences to help us kind of lead the initiative, we began with a theoretical understanding of when and why displacement may or may not occur. And I know within practitioner circles, I have many friends, whenever you say theory or science, those are bad words, right? That they don't apply to the practitioner realm. But a theory is simply an explanation. And so we have explanations that exist that can help us to understand in more detail the nature of displacement and ostensibly convergence. One of the early works on this was by a criminologist named John Eck at the University of Cincinnati, and he developed this idea of familiarity, decay, and displacement. And in essence, he just predicted that the more familiar that offenders would be with alternative crime opportunities, the more likely they would be to displace. The less familiar they are with other crime opportunities, the less likely they would be to displace. And so this gives a little kind of schematic on the continuum within which displacement may or may not occur. Next slide. And if we take kind of that general idea and we extend the other crime science explanations that have been tested and proven valid in a wide variety of contexts, we can extend more precisely the factors and the characteristics that might influence displacement or inhibit the possibility of displacement. The first is offender motivation. We recognize in the long history of criminological study that some offenders are highly motivated while others are more opportunistic. Opportunistic offenders may be less likely to displace, while those who are highly motivated may be more likely to displace. Offender familiarity, as I just mentioned, would also influence the susceptibility for displacement to occur. And then finally, the environmental framework that presents the possibility of crime opportunities also plays a vital role in determining whether or not displacement and convergence would occur. And within crime opportunity, we might think about the proximity that offender has to those new opportunities once the opportunities that they have been capitalizing on have been shut down. We might think about the facilitators that are required for offenders to engage in the given transnational crime, the necessary conditions, government corruptions, complicity, etc. And importantly, we've learned the importance of competitors and rivals amongst organized crime groups are often regulated and governed geographically. And so displacement may not occur into those areas that are informally regulated. And so kind of extending it yet further, offenders' knowledge or their cognitive map is limited on how to commit various crimes. And so that might be a factor that influences displacement. Offenders are less likely to offend in unfamiliar conditions. Motivated offenders, even those who might be more likely to displace, it might take time as they have to learn and search for new crime opportunities. That, at least in the short term, should reduce the likelihood of displacement. Opportunistic offenders would be likely to desist and not put forth the effort needed to capitalize on new crime opportunities. Many offenders have time windows, which has been used within the idea of journey to crime, that says that if crime opportunities in the immediate areas or within their time window are shut down, they're less likely to seek out new opportunities because they have limited time to commit those crimes. And then again, the illicit markets are often regulated by other turf zones and organized crime groups that play a factor. And so, yet again, for schematic purposes, if we were to extend these concepts of offender motivation, offender familiarity, and crime opportunity, and identify specific variables that might influence each of those concepts, we might be thinking on the transnational level about taking some appraisal of the extent of poverty, economic opportunities, the role of government in oppression, also looking at skill sets and the level of expertise and technical skills that might be necessary to switch into a different type of transnational crime, geographic awareness, spaces, cognitive maps, network access, product access, etc. These are not intended to be exclusive, but they simply demonstrate, I think, the complexity that lies underneath this idea of displacement. And so lest we fall into this trap of absolutism and we begin to peel back the layers of the environmental landscape and behavioral characteristics, we begin to see, and we learn from the crime science literature, that displacement is likely much more complicated than is originally conceived and claimed. And there are many, many variables that can influence the extent of displacement. A useful way, or one way that crime scientists have begun thinking about displacement is the idea of benign and malignant, and it rests on this idea of harm. And that crime behavior, most if not all crime behaviors, produce some harm within the communities in which they occur. And the same is certainly true for transnational crime. And if we think about the harms that could be displaced, even if displacement occurs, the harm that it results in can be less than the original problem that was targeted. And that would be an example of benign displacement, that even though some level or type of displacement occurred following an intervention, a border security effort, etc., the apparent shift could produce less harm. And so it can still be a positive gain. It can still be beneficial. On the other end of that spectrum is we have this idea of malign displacement, and that's where harm or the intervention or policy or program made matters worse, and it produced more harm within the communities for people in regions of the world. And so that again shows the spectrum within which we might think about displacement effects and ostensibly convergence as well. Next slide. And so it was with that understanding from the literature of the crime sciences and mostly over 30 years of study of displacement at the local domestic level that we used as a framework as we began working with the study authors of the book project and used those frameworks to helping us begin analyzing and improving our understanding of displacement and convergence along transnational crime flows. And so here's just a few examples. I won't go into too much detail. These come from the various chapters within the book. One is an example of the Egyptian law that was passed in 2016, which was the only one in the region to criminalize human smuggling. And the study authors observed some apparent displacement as they began to capitalize on this heterogeneity across that border region and shifted migratory or human smuggling activities into those areas where there were no criminalized laws in place or no laws in place against it. Another example might relate to the role that legitimate entry and access into or across border regions plays, and when those legitimate access or corridors are closed through different regulatory policy, that those can actually create illicit markets for smuggling and result in varieties of displacement into the other areas. And that was from another chapter of the book. And then finally, we also recognize, and it's been recognized in various parts of the world, that sometimes border efforts and security efforts can create more dangerous conditions and hazardous conditions for migrants as they go into different areas, changing tactics and overloading boats and resulting in migrant casualties. And we've seen that historically in the US-Mexico border, but also in the South European borders as well. And so those are just a few examples. Those are the contexts within which we began thinking about this work. And I will now turn it over to my colleague, Dr. Aziani, to discuss crime convergence. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Rob. And indeed, while we were thinking about this conceptual framework of the displacement, which is, I mean, as Rob said, like fundamental to interpretation and evaluation of policies, and not only at the national level, but also at the international level, we started to think also to another parallel concept, which is the one of convergence, which means basically to think to the effect of the same law enforcement activities or the same policies, and to see to what extent they might cause different crimes and different forms of crimes to merge in a single situation. And also in this case, we can articulate this concept in different forms of merging, of different forms of convergence. And in parallel with the concept of displacement, we might have convergence in terms of space, so spatial convergence. You might think to different trafficking activities that start to occur on the same route to connect, for example, two different countries. But also we might have forms of temporal convergence. So, for example, in the case of human smuggling and another trafficking activity, they might start to occur in the same period of the year or eventually in the same moment of the day. We might have forms of target convergence. So the same type of victims start to be victimized by different forms of crime, but also tactical convergence. So they use the exploitation of the same modus operandi or the same strategy to be active in different illegal markets. Offense convergence, and in parallel again, also offender convergence. And within the framework of the project, we specifically focused on trafficking activity and transnational crimes, and we took in consideration these forms of merging between different transnational crimes, 7 for, let's say, commodities and goods, and human smuggling. And we tried to cover through the chapters the main trafficking activities. So we took into consideration drugs, weapons, tobacco products, but also wildlife, medicine, and cultural artifacts. And from the conceptual point of view, some of the reasons that might lead to different forms of crime to converge in space, time, forms of tactics might be the same one that Rob introduced with respect to the displacement. So there is a dimension of familiarity or opportunity. Thanks in terms of transnational activities, familiarity might be the capacity to have connections with people working, for example, within customs. So I'm a group, I'm taking, I'm dealing with drug trafficking. I know people in the custom, and through this knowledge, through this contact, I start to traffic and introduce in a country also a different type of commodity. And this, in a way, is as said, is similar to what we say with respect to displacement. But at the same time, when we think to convergence, there might be also an incentive for the criminals themselves to try to merge different activities, regardless of the pressure of the law enforcement. Indeed, by managing multiple activities, the groups and the criminals might become more resilient and also potentially have more revenues. So there is also this dimension. And the consequence is that in the case in which we do actually observe convergence, we might have two possible negative implications or negative situation. The first one that I was introducing is the fact that the groups themselves that start to operate in different markets, for example, they might become more powerful, they might have more revenues, and in this way, they might become more influential and resilient. On the other side, we might have a convergence in targets, and so the negative consequences of the crime insist even more on a single person or in a single community or in a single state. Okay, and so if you think that different trafficking activities start to converge in an area, in a state which is already perhaps fragile from economic, political, social point of view, this obviously might create further problems for that state. In consideration of this potentially very negative impacts, we observe that despite the fact that the concept is often not so much defined, and despite the fact that there is no much empirical literature, convergence between different trafficking activities is often claimed by the media, by political authorities, and also law enforcement agencies, okay? Because in a way, this is a way to stress the problematic of the crime itself. So starting from these premises within the book, our intention was exactly to try to see to what extent these forms of convergence actually emerge in reality. And we think that this might have important implication for policy purposes that Ernesto will illustrate in the third part of our presentation. So also with respect to convergence, the different in the book you can find different chapters that investigate the concept in different contexts at a different level. And we have, as an example that I'm providing here on the left of the slide, analysis made at the macro level. So in this case, the author was investigating the convergence between the trafficking of cocaine and the trafficking of cannabis in the area of Latin America and along the routes that connect Latin America to Europe. And what you observe is double forms of convergence. On the first moment, we have a convergence in tactical ways. So the people and the groups that were able to traffic cannabis started to exploit their knowledge, their networks, their skill set to start to traffic also cocaine. And in this case, you have also forms of transnational convergence in a space domain. And this specific aspect has been then observed and effectively, let's say, discussed also by the same UNODC in the latest drug report. Then we have some other example of studies that moved a little bit more into the microanalysis of criminal events. And the example I'm providing you with was focusing on the simultaneous occurrences of human smuggling and the trafficking of illicit goods. And what the authors observed is that not all the forms of convergence occur with the same frequency. Actually, they were able to identify 3 forms of convergence, like spatial, tactical, and offender convergence, that were more frequent. So in terms of space, they have been observing that along certain specific routes, both illicit goods like drugs and migrants were moving. And at the same time, sometimes people were using similar tactics to introduce people in a different country, but also illicit good. An example, I think, kind of interesting is the use of jet skis between Gibraltar and Spain. And in few cases, we observed also offender convergence, so groups that were able to operate in more than one illegal activities. As a final example, I'm going to stay, let's say, with at the micro level, and in this case, the authors were trying to estimate the extent to which human smuggling converged with other trafficking activities. What's the frequency in which 2 crimes actually occur simultaneously, so in exact same episode, in the same moment. And as you can see, it's very rare. They observed that only in 3.4% of all the episodes, the human smuggling phenomenon was going on in parallel with trafficking activities. And I think this reconnects to what Rob was saying about displacement. Although theoretically this type of phenomena might do occur, and although they might have impact on society, we cannot assume that in every case and in every situation, we are going to observe this kind of phenomenon. And in this specific case, this might be interpreted to the fact that the nature of the different trafficking activities are often quite different. So it's not immediate, it's not easy for all the groups active in a specific market to have the skills, to have the intention, to have the know-how, the resources to move to different activities or to conduct 2 activities in parallel. So in the book, as said, you will find this kind of example and others that investigate and provide empirical evidence of this line of reasoning. I'm concluding with this, and I will leave the floor to Ernesto for his presentation of the lesson learned.
Thanks, Alberto. Thanks, Giovanna and UN Library for the kind invitation. And thanks to Alberto and Rob for joining the efforts in producing the book and this presentation. Lessons learned means what are the main consequences of the conceptual framework that explains displacement and convergence in terms of crime. Let me start from the 2 main conclusions of the research and the book. Displacement hinders the efficiency and the effectiveness of regulatory changes and law enforcement operations, and resulting in counterproductive outcomes. On the other side, convergence can increase or exacerbate the impact of crime on the most vulnerable communities and individuals in the society. let me make an example of today. Until now, Italy is a vulnerable country because of the smuggling routes between North Africa and Italy, but Italy is the last part of Europe, and European member states or European countries do not have a common policy toward North African countries, and they do not have policies for stopping the human smuggling and human trafficking. What is happening today, and it's extremely interesting in terms of consequences of the displacement action, is that single country, including my country, Italy, are doing individual agreements with the countries of the North Africa, Spain with Morocco, Italy with Tunisia, and Libya, and sometimes they go to Tunisia and they lose Libya. And what happens? You can follow the routes, and it's extremely interesting that once the agreement has been reached that the local country could stop smuggling, the smuggling routes moves to another place. The example of November is that less people are coming from Tunisia and more people are coming from Libya. And this could be seen across the last 5 years when one route moves across the other route. And you can read these different geography of the routes, smuggling routes, according to the different agreements, legislation, as Robert said about Egyptian. So, practically speaking, this means that single agreements are costly, do not work because of displacement, and the displacement conceptual framework helps a lot to understanding what is changing in North African routes. My question goes over the research in the book, is how to mitigate this effort and transform crisis in opportunities for growth. And I think this is really extremely important because in a way or the other, policies should change quite fast. Also, if there is a resistance on the side of European countries to implement common policy toward North African countries, and toward African countries also, because North African countries are only the terminal of some routes which are coming from Sahel, from other places. Well, the idea is having an integrated approach between Africa and Europe. In a way or the other, European countries need migrants, and African countries want to send people out from Africa. So this could be seen as a collaborative strategy that could benefit both continents. What are the main components of this approach? How to design and implement it? The first one is reducing international asymmetries. Together with Alberto and many other people in Transcrime, we know that international asymmetries in legislation and in policy produce loopholes that are filled by criminals. Criminals exploit the loopholes of the asymmetries. If there is a policy in one country, they go where there is no policy in the other country. And they move very flexible because these markets are extremely flexible. So legislation or legislative asymmetries are one of the main source of the loopholes which are exploited by criminals. The other policy is crime control policies that should be coordinated. In few words, we cannot have one country implementing crime control policies, but we need really a coordination about crime control policies through international and supranational and international organizations. And this will be the only way to keep an equilibrium between countries and minimizing the risk of conflicts, weak institutions, and fragile economies. Remember that organized crime has a stable link with fragility of countries. There is an equation that could be said: more fragile is a country, more organized crime is there. Less fragility, less organized crime. After the crime control policies, I think what we need to tailor is specific locally solutions. Countries in Africa which have the need to send migrants to Europe and other countries deserve specific solutions, and let me say, customized solutions about. This really is the effect of what we call the special convergence of crime. We need to avoid the risk of concentration of crime because instead of improving the quality of life of this country, we will deteriorate further the life and the vulnerability of this country. The other action could be expand legal migration channels. We speak a lot about these expanding legal migration channels as other countries in the world have been doing. There is a long debate in Europe, which is the most relevant continent at the moment dealing with African countries, how to expand legal migration channels. Countries in Europe, 27 countries, do not agree on a common policy about migration. They are doing a lot of efforts in trying to do, but just because migration is a very sensitive political issue, in many countries there is countries are shy to implement these legal migration channels in their own country. You look at how many conflicts there are between Italy, France, England, which is not part of European Union, Germany also. And we are trying to find solutions such as the last one where Italy is sending to Albania migrants, or Germany wants to do exactly the same thing in the next few days. Or we externalizing the effort in some ways. If we are not able to keep in Italy, we send to another country such as Albania, which I think is not solving the problem of the European discussion about migration. It could help Italian government to do this, but not solving the problem of legal migration. The other is much more comprehensive and difficult, but people are speaking about now. Italian government is launching what they call Piano Mattei. Other countries in Europe think that from many years without implementing it, the best strategy will be investing in economic development and education of African population. I think investing in economic development and education of African population could be a challenge, but could be in a long term the winning medal for changing the situation today. Once we will be capable to develop African countries, once we will be able to prepare qualified people for migration, things will change. And I hope this could be realized in a short time. After the investment create consensus, government in transit and destination country should accompany reforms on with consensus building campaigns. We need to inform population, citizens of African countries, and also in Europe, let me say, that migration policies are very convenient for both sides, Europe and African countries. This is very difficult for what I have said before, because migration is a very sensitive political issue, and creating consensus building campaigns around this topic, it's a very difficult job. The other conclusion, let me put it in this way, could be research implications of the book and of the research which is behind the book. What we have done in the book is analyzing some data sources at the macro level, and when we go on micro level, time series data on transnational crimes and enforcement operation are lacking, which means displacement and convergence could be analyzed if you have at your disposal very good data, and at the moment these data are not available. The research shows that it's not easy to find this data around, and in some ways we have been using open sources to find them, or other interviews with other people in order to collect data that could help to improve the quality of the conceptual framework about displacement and convergence. And let me say that in concluding my remarks, is the experience of the research in the book was very productive. What we are looking today is what could be the consequences of this framework. But for sure, the theoretical framework behind, in terms of convergence and displacement, it's extremely useful for analyzing a lot of macro crimes. In this case, we've been analyzing smuggling routes from North Africa to Europe, but it could be applied in many other places. Thanks a lot for the attention.
Many thanks to the three of you. Colleagues, I'm going to open up the floor for questions. I have a few. So, I mean, as you mentioned, and specifically with migrants, with illegal migration, it's an incredibly challenging thing to get countries to agree. There's lots of opportunity for criminals to exploit the lack of coherence. When you did this research, did you find any examples historically or currently in other parts of the world where such cooperation was going better to deter crime?
Rob, probably the Mexican border could be a good example of these.
I don't know if I would put that up there as being an example of a successful, initiative or comprehensive initiative, but it's certainly one that I think exemplifies the many challenges of potentially putting together a comprehensive multinational approach. And the latest evolution of the migration channels through the Darien Gap, which is much further south of the border, I think also exemplifies the complexity of, we're not talking just about the immediate border regions between nation states, but the implications that border policies can have much further down the chain from through transit countries and leaving origin countries.
If I may add, Giovanna, we didn't specifically look to positive. Actually, we didn't either look specifically for negative. We were like observing what was going on at the moment, and not so many good examples came up. But to me, if I have to think historically, what has been done in Europe with the creation of the European Union and the Schengen Agreement in terms of migration, it has been amazing and unbelievable in terms at least of freedom of movement and reduction of criminal externalities. I mean, I could easily now go to work in Sweden and with no need at all to rely on networks of smuggler or to ask for the help of someone to actually get into the country. But I think the criminological perspective and the implication for crime shouldn't be obviously the only layer through which make any kind of evaluation. But if we are focusing on that, the example of the European Union has been like phenomenal. And it is actually very recent in the end. It's not something that needed so many decades.
Oh, absolutely. It's no, I think the EU example is a great example. It's just even within the EU, the lack of coordination to stop the smuggling, the human smuggling that happens is also telling. It's like within the borders, everything is pretty good, and within each country, there's a lack of agreement. But there's a lot of countries in the EU and have very different perspectives on how they want to deal with the migrant smuggling issue. I was also curious at the beginning, you talked about criminals, the likelihood of them displacing or finding other ways to converge, you said had to do with familiarity. I'm just curious if you were able to measure, I mean, it's familiarity and opportunity. but I was wondering if you were able to measure in the scant, empirical evidence that you were able to find, what the likelihood was of an intervention. I mean, is it specific to the criminal you're dealing with? So how savvy they are, how motivated they are, or is it more to do with the actual intervention as to the likelihood of a displacement or convergence?
For what I know, in the book, I think Rob was speaking about the Egyptian example. Egypt was the only country implementing the UN UNODC Convention against Transnational Organized Crime, with the two protocols, smuggling and trafficking. And once they were capable to implement it, it looks, according to the book, that the flows between Egypt and Europe, Italy, let me say, was diminishing because of these, which means, but it was a completely insulated case because on the north part of Africa, you have not only Egypt, but you have Algeria, Libya, Tunis, etc. Today, it's, as I said, interesting because we are having an agreement, economic agreement between the European Union and Tunisia, providing a lot of money to them for stopping smuggling. And as soon as this was known, the flow for migrants went again to Libya, where the agreements are too old to be implemented, and the migrants moved to Libya, paying a very big amount of money for going from Libya. So, it's a very flexible market where you move from one side to the other. This is alerting international organization. Does not mean to pumping a lot of money to the individual country. You need to have an international approach to this, instead of giving money to this and this and this government, because this will be a waste of resources and not stopping the consequences of these.
Absolutely.
And just to follow up on that, Giovanni, to kind of address your question, I think the answer is it's still very premature to be able to say, what of these variables is most influential in predicting displacement. Our purpose here was to try to kind of push the ball forward in developing systematic empirical analyses and a framework for understanding it. But there's a tremendous amount of work to be done in this regard. So I don't think we would be in a position to give an answer to that as to which one. But hopefully, future research, better data, more informed policies could lead us to that.
Yeah, it's. I totally agree with the point Rod was making, and also Ernesto showed in his presentation about some aspects are at the moment really difficult to investigate, at least at the quantitative level with quantitative methodology, because the collection of data is so scant that for research is actually very difficult, and some of these data are also extremely expensive to eventually collect. So it's unlikely that single researcher or single research institution like university will be able to do it like in a broad manner. And to me, was striking while working during the project, especially in terms of enforcement. So the information that we do have on enforcement activities against transnational crimes in most countries, also like global north country, are basically absent or not accessible to research, which obviously limits a lot the possibility to empirically test these theories, but also to evaluate the policies.
Thank you. Yes, it is a challenging landscape, and I really applaud you for taking this on and at least, finding a way to start framing the research and looking at the gaps and what needs to be done. So I think the work is important, and I'm really, really happy that you've been able to join us and share this with us. Colleagues, do you have any other questions before we close the session? Feel free to raise your hand too if you'd like to take the floor. So at the moment, I don't see anything. Gentlemen, I am very grateful for having had this opportunity to learn from you and to hear about the book. And yes, I will be in touch. Colleagues, thank you for taking the time to meet with us and to listen to the conversation. And we look forward to our next talk. And thank you, gentlemen. Really greatly appreciated.
Thanks to you for your invitation.
Thanks, Joanna.
Yeah.
All the
Thank you,
best.
Giovanna. Yeah.
Thanks
Take
to all
care.
the participants.
Ciao Rob, ciao Alberto.
Ciao Ernesto, ciao Rob.
Ciao. Bye-bye.
Ciao.
Ciao Giovanna.